introduce myself a bit and the Narwhal. I'm speaking to you from my nation's homeland, the Squamish Nation, also known as North Vancouver. And yeah, we would love to hear where you're joining from too. So please enter where you are coming from in the chat box. And also if you'd like, what native food is your favorite from the place that you live. Hello, Paul. So I'm just going to wait a couple minutes to kind of let people begin trickling in. Awesome. For anyone just joining, I invited you to put where you're from and if you'd like, your favorite native food from where you're from. So today's discussion is about food sovereignty and the connected issue of food security. And it follows a series of reporting that I did with the Narwhal called Nourish that you can find online. And there will be some more stories coming out in that series as well. And this event was made possible with the support of the Real Estate Foundation of BC. And I'm here with Jess and Tyrone, who I will introduce a little bit more thoroughly in a minute, but I want to make sure that we have lots of attendees first. So a little bit about the Narwhal, if you're not familiar with us. We're a 5-year-old digital publication that focuses on in-depth and investigative journalism about the natural world in Canada. And I am part of our BC Bureau team, which is where the Narwhal got its start. And now we also have bureaus in Ontario and in the prairies. If you hear a funny yelping sound, it's my dog in her sleep. We are a leader of nonprofit journalism in Canada, supported by over 5,900 members now at the Narwhal, which is crazy. And thank you to everyone in the audience who is already a member. If you're not already a member, you can check out the link. One of our team members will drop in the chat, but it slows down maybe. I see Catherine dropped it in. But anyone who joins today for any monthly or annual amount can get one of our iconic Narwhal toques. And Jess could attest to the quality of this toque because their kids keep stealing every toque we send. So yeah, any monthly or annual amount, and you will receive one of these toques, very thick, cushy, and comfortable. And a bit more about the Narwhal. Our reporting recently took home 3 Jack Webster Awards for excellence in legal journalism, excellence in environment reporting, and excellence in multimedia journalism. So a huge congrats to all my BC team members who were the recipients of those awards. And yeah, for anyone who joined a couple minutes late, I am Stephanie. My ancestral name is Kwetásel'wet. I am a BC reporter with the Narwhal, and I'm hosting today from my nation's lens, the Squamish Nation. So before we get the panel started, here's a couple housekeeping notes. The session is being recorded and will be available for viewing online after the event. So you can look out for an email tomorrow in your inbox with a link to the video and the chat discussion, and only attendees will have access to the chat transcription. We also provide automated closed captioning. So to turn it on, you can go to the control panel at the bottom of your screen. For me, it's just a little button with 3 dots. And then you can either select the arrow next to the CC icon to turn it on. Mine was a little bit different and it just said caption. So just search for the menu but probably click the arrow next to the CC icon to turn it on. And then once you select the caption settings, you can control the size of the captions and put them anywhere on the screen that you like. If you're having any trouble finding them, just message us and someone can help you out. And also thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We received a lot of questions, at least over 70. I couldn't quite count them all from attendees, and we're going to get through as many as we can, do our best to get through with the time we have. And if you have questions as we go along, please enter them in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to them as well. I tried to sort of like sprinkle them through my plan for the conversation. And we are so grateful to have our panelists with us today to talk about food. And so I will do a short introduction of them both, but then I'll give them each a minute or two to also introduce themselves. So I'll start with Jess. Jess is a Healtsec parent, poet, and land-based educator living in their homelands and the community of Bella Bella, BC. They are executive director of the Qqs Projects Society, a Healtsec charitable nonprofit, which is focused on supporting youth and families to thrive through community and cultural programming, a lot of which does focus on food. And they also founded Coastal Foodways, which supports Central Coast communities in building food systems resiliency. And Jess is someone I've interviewed many a time. So Jess, you can just take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Qqs. Thank you so much for inviting me to be in community with all of you today. I want to start, I know this is a little tricky. I want to start by just turning my computer around and showing you what I'm looking at and telling you what I shared with folks as this call was just getting started, that we are on day 2 of 4 humpback whales lunge feeding and bubble netting right offshore from my office. And it's just been such a beautiful reminder of the interconnection and interdependence in our lands and waters. And it's been such a beautiful thing to witness. I'm incredibly privileged to do the work that I do in my community and in this region, where sometimes food security feels incredibly precarious because of how geographically remote we are and how dependent we are on freighting in so much of our groceries. But I'm struck, like, literally every day in the work I do by just the incredible strength and resilience and innovation of folks in Central Coast communities to find ways to localize our food economy and work together to ensure that we are all fed and all nourished. So I'm really grateful to do this work and to be able to share a little bit about it with you today. Jessica.
Thanks so much. And our other panelist is Tyrone McNeil. Tyrone is Stallo and a member of the Seabird Island Band. Tyrone wears many hats, such as being president of the First Nation Education Steering Committee, board member of the Seabird Island Economic Development Corporation, Stallo Tribal Council president and tribal chief, and chair of the Emergency Planning Secretariat, which supports 31 Coast Salish communities in improving emergency preparedness. Tyrone is also an active hunter, fisher, and gatherer, and looks forward to teaching his 4 grandchildren as he has been taught and learned. Another person I've interviewed many a time, Tyrone, if you just want to take a minute to also introduce yourself a little further.
Yeah, hi, Stephanie. First of all, I'm calling in from my First Nations Education Steering Committee office here in West Vancouver, and acknowledging my co-Salish relatives for hosting our office here. A couple of things I'd add, Stephanie. I was on the Minister's Advisory Council to the Minister of Agriculture here in BC, and I was frustrated at the lack of progress there, and I actually stepped away from it. But the chair, who's a buddy of mine, twisted my arm to come back in as a strategic advisor to that council, so involved in agriculture provincially there. And I'm really interested in the regulatory perspective, what it is we're doing. And I've been chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council to the Canada Energy Regulator for the last 3.5 years. So learning about the regulatory frameworks that also lead into and support what it is we're talking about here around food security, food access, but from a regulatory perspective, right? Because there's a lot of different regulations out there. Some are prescriptive and come with fines if you don't follow them. Others are best suggestions, best advice, and in the end, the governments are powerless. So I think it's important when we're talking about food that we also bring in a regulatory context just to make sure that we're not too liberal in its applications or its intention. And the beauty there for me, Stephanie, is we need the opportunity to co-develop those regulations or co-amend existing regulations to better recognize our worldview, to respect our inherent Aboriginal and Indigenous rights, and more importantly, allow us to modify languages to accommodate where climate is taking us over the coming decades. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. And I really look forward to hearing you be able to share your expertise on that perspective from both of you, each of your areas of expertise. So I thought the best way to start the conversation is to talk a bit about the terms that we're using, food security and food sovereignty, and the differences and the connections between the two, to help everyone kind of differentiate between the two, but also just share what it means to you personally and what a food secure or food sovereign future looks like to you, like what you picture. So maybe Jess, you can kind of start us off there.
Yeah, sure. I think I tend not to get too hung up on the language that we use around this. I mean, I understand the distinction between food security as, sorry, they're like literally the humpbacks are lunge feeding right in front of me. I should really be looking a different direction. I understand food security as, a state in which we all have access to the food we need, as food sovereignty as a state in which, we have control over our food and we have the ability to choose abundant, culturally appropriate foods that are consistent with our values. Like I see the arc of the narrative and the different terminology that folks use. But ultimately, for me, what it really comes down to is, are the people that I love fed? Is my community fed? Are we nourished? Do we have enough? Do we have abundance that we can share to reinforce our connections and loved ones in other communities? And I think for me, keeping it at that really foundational level helps me to stay really grounded in the work that I do. And so yeah, I tend not to think too much about the buzzwords, but to ask myself frequently, do the people I love have enough to eat?
So much. And Tyrone.
I'm actually at the other end of that spectrum, Jess. We worked with governments too long to be too liberal in definitions. We kind of come up with an idea or a term, and government interprets it a different way, and particularly in ways that limits their involvement, limits their contributions or investment. So not that I'm at the extreme other end of the pendulum, but it's a really clear understanding that when we're talking about food security broadly and generally, for me, it's about those that produce the food, whether they be agriculture based or poultry or swine, but it's food production, right? And those folks need access to market because we need the ability to walk into the grocery stores when we need it to buy our groceries. So then we need access to that market ourselves too, right? So that's from that. I describe it as an industrialized food production. And then the fourth aspect of food for me is our traditional foods and medicines, and that we have access to them. For me, being Stalo, like a lot of other First Nations of BC, we're salmon people, we're fish people. We've got early anthropological evidence that around contact, where my ancestors were consuming about 1,000 pounds of salmon per capita. So we certainly don't do that anymore due to DFO's mismanagement. So that's why I bring in the regulation aspect of it, Stephanie, that we need to modify regulations that recognize our rights, recognize our relation to certain foods. And we quite often, I call them our non-human relations. We've got ancient protocols with them that are spiritual, they're cultural, they're personal amongst us, and that needs to be maintained. So I tend to categorize food in those four areas, but there's a lot to each area, but I'll leave it there for now, Stephanie.
I think that was such a great place to start the conversation, and just like the different focuses that we each have, and also just the terminology itself, the words that we're using and how attached we are to them. I think it's a really good place to start the conversation. And kind of speaking about the whales and the fish and the salmon people, I think it would be really good to begin there talking about how to build resilient food systems when we know that so many of the ecosystems and species that we relied on for a long time are struggling and are not as plentiful as they were, as Tyrone was just speaking about. Some of the most recent data that I saw showed that the Fraser River sockeye have declined 54% in the past decade compared to all preceding years. That just came out from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and we could point to many more examples. So how do we try to build up our ability to rely on these foods, eat them more? People have been going without these foods for so long, but also while they're at like kind of historic lows or have been going through a lot of damage for a while. I don't know who to ask first. Maybe I'll ask you to start, Tyrone, because I asked Jess last time.
Depending if it's salmon or elk or moose or deer or mushrooms, regardless what it is, Stephanie, it's safe to say that they're all struggling at one level or another. Anywhere here in BC, anyway, not sure about other parts of the country, but in BC. So I think the starting point there for me is to take a look at the current state of what that food is. Take salmon, for example. And I would argue with that percentage decline, Stephanie. I think it's more in the neighborhood of 90% decline. Because historically we'd get between 30 and 50 million salmon if all runs here in the Fraser River. And last year we had 1.5 million, just under 1.5 million. So you look at the decline, you look at the environmental conditions. There's not a great amount we can do about the drought situations, the warm water situations. So when you look at salmon, you kind of, in my mind, I back off a little bit. Okay, climate is there. We acknowledge that there might be things we do to mitigate, but it's pretty iffy. So what else is impacting the numbers generally, but the resilience, the strength of each individual salmon, and fish farms come into play there. They open net fish farms in the West Coast on the migratory routes, and we've been taking them out with a lot of political pressure, and the salmon return. So you look at what are man-made causes of decline of something like salmon? What can we do about it? In this case, stop permitting the fish farms, and it adds to the strength and vigor and resilience of the salmon on the way out, on the out migration and in migration. So it needs to be looked at in that context, because if we have resilient salmon unimpeded by diseases and parasites, then they can fight climate better themselves. And then from there, we look at, given that's due to DFO mismanagement, some of the salmon runs are either extirpated or virtually extirpated. How can we reintroduce them in those systems with a little bit of man-made help initially, but naturalize over time? And we take a look at the deer population, what impacts of wildfires, forest fires have had on them, moose and elk and whatnot, the arid conditions in the forestry, affecting their food supply, affecting their water supply and quality too. And again, it's environmental. What can you do? It's pretty limited, but there might be other factors we can put in there to bolster their strength and their resilience, and give them the best fighting chance we possibly can for them to fight the climate conditions that they're undergoing as each species. I hope that makes sense, Stephanie.
Absolutely. And Jess, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one important thing to recognize that I don't want to lose is that what our food systems look like depends very heavily on where we are. And so, Tyrone, you're talking a lot about industrialization, agriculture. Those are not things that are particularly at play where I am in a very small geographically remote community on the outer Central Coast. So I recognize that the context that we do this work in really impacts what the work looks like on the ground. And I know here one really important piece of work that we've been trying to do is identify and take stock of where different species are at. Clearly there are massive impacts to salmon, to herring, to all of these species that we've traditionally relied on very heavily, both for food, social, and ceremonial use and for commercial harvesting. But there's also been a recognition in the community that there are lots of ancestral foods that we haven't been commonly eating in recent generations. And there's been a really strong desire expressed by community members to start revitalizing our connection to those food systems, or those aspects of our food systems. And so some of the work that my organization's been doing in the community has been working with hunters and fishers to go out on the land and make those foods more accessible to folks again. And there are the population of people that we're talking about here is maybe 1,500 people in Bala Bala. We're not tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of people here. And so being able to look to things like seal, for example, is something that's not been commonly eaten by most generations in the community recently, but something that is relatively abundant and also impacting other stocks of fish in the territory. Whether there's an opportunity to teach people how to hunt seal again, how to prepare seal again, reintroduce that into our diet so that it's taking pressure off of other species that we would otherwise be leaning on, and helping to diversify how we connect with our local food system. And, clearly there's also lots of access issues. It's challenging and expensive for folks to get out on the land and get out to harvest seasonally all of the different things that are available for ancestral proteins or ancestral plant foods. And so we do recognize that there's also a need to look at food production in the community, in greenhouses, how we can extend our growing season, how we can be working not just at a community level, but also a household level to empower people to grow a portion of their own food to eat. And, I recognize that the solutions that we're looking at here are very different from what's going to make sense in a larger or more urban environment. But I think for us, it's really been about deepening our sense of connectivity to our food systems, becoming more aware of the state of our food system, like in a very holistic way. And then really rebuilding our connection to different species that have historically been really important parts of our diet.
Thanks for bringing up that point, because even just writing this theories. It's like the land is so diverse, the species are so diverse, not far away, right? Like in a short drive, you're going to just be in a totally different situation. And so there will be no like single answer that can go across like the whole country we call Canada that's so diverse and large. That's a really good point to make. And speaking about the sort of like production side, the agriculture side, I know that that is something, yeah, that Tyrone, you talked about a lot, and particularly looking at the Fraser Valley, because once again, it is helpful to keep it very specific because all of the answers are different in different places. But you really talked about the kind of history of, like kind of food production in the Fraser Valley, how it's changed, and your thoughts on what the future should look like. I was hoping you could kind of dive into that a little bit.
Let me back up a little bit, bridging what Jess raised and come into that, Stephanie, because I'm thinking a lot of what it is we're proposing to do is about re-educating our own families, our own citizens on our relations to the land, the landscape, the resources, our non-human relations. And when I'm thinking about that, Stephanie, I'm thinking about everything governments of all levels have done to separate us from that. Going back to concepts of terra nullius, the doctrine of discovery, we're less than human. And it wasn't that long ago, we weren't allowed off the reserves of an Indian nation approving it. So we couldn't go out and hunt and harvest and whatnot and maintain the forest understory like we traditionally would. So it's been intentionally removed from us. Luckily and thankfully, we've got some elders that have carried that on to teach us to go out there and do the same. But it's incumbent upon us to pass that on to our kids, our grandkids, and if we're really lucky, our great grandkids as well. So I think that's an important note to make, is that this disconnect, this lack of education, lack of awareness, lack of relation isn't of our doing. If it were of our doing, our kids be out on the land learning all year round, like we did. Had the good fortune of when we were young back in the 60s and the generations before that as well. But when you come into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, you're not seeing as many people out on the land. You're not seeing kids out on the land or out on the water in Jess's case. And learning those things that have been passed down to generation after generation that you can't teach in a textbook. You have to get them out there. I think that's a big piece when we're talking about access to food, is to understand relations, understand the historic relations to foods. Now you bring, and from I would argue, Stephanie, from an inherent right perspective, because my teachers, mentors tell me when we explain our rights in that inherent pre-contact fashion, it supersedes and is paramount over any provincial or federal laws or policies or regulations, right? So, but how do we codify that? And I think we need opportunities to sit down and chat. What does that mean? Access to overcome these private property signs that are on roads up into the back country and whatnot. And then you open the door for opportunities to learn. Then look at it from a multi-generational perspective again, Steph, because we're not going to fix it. I say fix clearly, in quotation marks, that problem here and now or in one generation. But if we improve each generation, that's probably the best we can do. So in that improving in each generation, the state of the land here in the Fraser Valley in Southwest British Columbia, we were strong in agriculture. Dairy is big, but there's a lot of poultry, a lot of swine, a lot of berry production, a lot of root crops and sweet corn, the whole gamut really. And we found over the years that the regulations, primarily the quota system, forced us out of out as our own food producers, definitely. If you go back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s here in the Fraser Valley, we had First Nations that were real entrepreneurs. They were farming big tracts of land, making really good money selling the produce. And then the governments introduced quotas in each area, and our ancestors couldn't afford the quotas of the day. So it forced them out of the system. And then there's a guy named Jimmy Pattison in the 70s and 80s came up and bought all the canneries that every Fraser Valley producer was sending food to be canned. He bought them all up and then he closed them all. So we were producing a lot of food for human consumption right up until the early 80s. Then after that, because there's no local cannery, it largely went to dairy. So if you think about how rich the agriculture industry here is in the lower mainland Fraser Valley, 70% of it is going to dairy. And out of that 70%, maybe 10 to 15% is consumed here in the Fraser Valley Lower Mainland. So the rest is generating milk and cheese and other products for export out of our territory here. So it really begs the question in my mind, when we're talking about food security, who's it security for? Is it purpose for our security locally, or is it security for an export type market, whether that be in other parts of BC, Canada, or North America, or the globe, right? So to reintroduce ourselves again back into those industries, I've told government, in my view, wearing my political hats, the quotas don't apply to us. They actually infringe on our rights. And I'm not interested in being compensated or achieving redress for that infringement. I want full access to those industries. If I want to put up a barn with 100,000 chickens, for example, in that industrialized agriculture, it's industrialized, right? I shouldn't have to be limited by quota to do that. Same as if I want to bring in some dairy milk, and even from a conservative estimate of like 30 to 50 head, for example, right? And there's some farms here in the valley that got thousands of head of dairy cows, and we're not allowed to participate. And that really upsets me, Stephanie, because not only is there an opportunity to enter into the food production aspect of it, it gives us more opportunities to be out in the elements, out on the land, out in the rain, out in the snow, out in the sun, producing food, but generating a livelihood off of it as well, employing our kids and our neighbors and whatnot, so that we can rebuild those skills and competencies in our younger generations, that over time that they become more active in it, because we need to occupy that landscape more often and more frequently, and a whole lot deeper. And things like quotas and regulations are preventing us from doing that. Access to market is preventing us from doing that. So we should look at our own branding, our own food production, that in my case is Stalo or Qqs, and put our logo and our stamp on it, and send that worldwide, because I'm sure there'll be a market for it. So now I really do think those opportunities are there. We just need to come together. And for us here in the valley, it's that kind of agriculture. But I know in the interior they're more into the Hereford type cows to growing meat and whatnot. They need slaughterhouses, but they're limited on where slaughterhouses can be located in proximity to each other by somebody's regulation that aren't ours. So I think, particularly with the incorporation of the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples here in BC and the United Nations Declaration Act federally, in my view, it takes all those impediments off the table, but it gives us an opportunity to come together. And how do we repopulate that table? How do we refill that table that recognizes our rights and our want for participation in the production of food of all sorts right across the country?
Jess, I imagine a lot of thoughts went through your head listening. Just want to get how everything Tyrone was saying connects to what that means, like what you see in Bella Bella. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, all of that was brilliant and, right on. I think the way that we see that manifesting here in terms of regulatory regimes being incredibly oppressive is, we've seen for generations as the government has regulated us away from our territory and away from the resources that we depend on, both for our own consumption and our own trade and things that we harvest commercially. We have seen licenses taken away from Indigenous people and redistributed to non-Indigenous fishers, and then we have seen those fisheries overfished until the stocks are crashing. There has just been this capitalism-driven, approach to management of those systems here, particularly in fisheries. It's just been unbelievably devastating. And I don't want to be too cynical, but, on the one hand, I can see how capitalism and the need to profit is driving it. I can also see really clearly that it's an effective tool to deepen the divide between us and our territories, to deepen the divide between us and our culture, and our cultural practices around food, our sense of connectivity to our food systems, which is so deeply part of our identity as Celtic people, as Indigenous people. You break our connection to our food systems, and you are breaking down a really core aspect of who we are. And has that not been the colonial agenda since contact? And so, I think that regulatory regimes are incredibly oppressive, not just in terms of taking away opportunities, but also in terms of really attacking our identity and our ability to just be our best Celtic selves, our strongest Celtic selves, our strongest Indigenous selves out, enacting our sovereignty and living our identities out in our own homelands.
And so what are some of maybe the best practices or kind of standard examples that either you both have experienced or just witnessed in confronting all of these obstacles and kind of, like getting these projects off the ground? Maybe examples of regulatory change, but what are some of the best practices and examples that come to mind in confronting all of this?
There's not a huge number of best practices jump out to mind right now, Stephanie. There are absolutely some success stories. The Okanagan, what they're doing around the greenhouse and food production there is a story that they need to tell themselves. We've got a small little Kappa community just upriver from me called Kanaka Bar. They're very close to being self-sufficient, Stephanie, where they're producing their own vegetables, their own fruits, their own poultry, swine, everything, and also they're producing their own electricity. So the past chief tells me that the power grid could go down and they've got electricity, the highways could be wiped out, and they still got their own food because not only are they producing themselves, they're storing it in community themselves as well. So there's those two stand out for me in terms of success. And the one kind of related to that, I'm hearing from post-secondary institutes that they're revisiting what it is they're doing to support the broader agricultural sector, where when I say historically, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, a lot of the colleges throughout BC taught short courses on animal husbandry, on fruit tree pruning, on poultry, those kind of things. But just about every one of them have switched from those short courses, week-long, 2-week-long courses, to bachelor's degrees and masters and even PhDs on it. So if you want a really advanced degree on anything agriculture, it's theirs for you to take. But if you're talking about building your capacity, building some competency, even a little bit of experience, post-secondary institutes are really looking at that and how can they better support British Columbians on building that capacity through short courses. And I think that'd be a real success as more of those institutes come to that place wherever they need to be to actually start re-looking at things that way, because that capacity support, that competence support is going to be critical going forward.
Jess, what examples come to your mind?
Yeah, I think what I'd love to share is how we've opted to do our food work here in our community in Bella, recognizing that you do need people who are advocating at a community level, a nation level, provincially, federally. But the way that I work is very community driven. So the organization that I run, Qqs Projects Society, we're a very multi-purpose organization. We've been in the community for 25 years, and we are here to say yes to things that the community wants done. And so we work in a really diverse range of projects and programs. And one of the pieces that's been emerging in a really big way over the last probably 6 or 8 years has been, issues around our food systems. And we operate on the basis that our community knows what it needs to thrive. It knows what the issues are. We don't need some outside expert to come in and tell us what's wrong or how to fix it. That wisdom is here. It's embedded in our community. And so in 2020, in the early stages of the pandemic, we reached out to our community and we did a comprehensive community food security assessment. We asked our community to answer questions around all sorts of different aspects of food security, their ability to manage specialty medical diets in the community with what's available here, their ability to get out on the land and access ancestral foods, whether the things that they need are in a grocery store at a price they can afford, all sorts of things. And also ask, what are your solutions? How do you want to be supported to be more food secure? We know there is deep food insecurity here. We really wanted to hear from community, but what do you want to be more supported? We walked away with 25 brilliant recommendations from our community, coming forward and resoundingly saying, there is an issue. Here is the issue. Here is how we want to be supported at a household level, at a family level, at an individual level, to be champions in changing the way food systems look in our community. And since then, my work has been about implementing what it is the community wants. So the work that I do and the work that my team supports happens in a very decentralized way. We are supporting people to grow food at home. We're providing, everything from raised beds and, help with soil remediation to composting units and seeds and seedlings and one-on-one support to troubleshoot in their gardens. We're hiring underemployed commercial fishers to go out and harvest ancestral foods to distribute in the community. We have a very conventional food bank and hamper program, which we recognize is a Band-Aid solution. It's not really promoting food security in our community, but our community members need to not be hungry. And so that's one of the very short-term pieces of work that we're doing around food. We're trying to show up in really good ways to empower people at a very grassroots level to be champions in changing what food security looks like in our community. And I get asked all the time, like, why don't you put in a big commercial greenhouse? Why don't you implement large-scale food production? Why don't you go big, take it huge? And realistically, those kinds of projects aren't going to work until we have the human capacity in the community to champion them and see them through and make sure that they are going in the direction we need them to go. And so while our approach has been decentralized, and you could argue that it's been a little bit slow, we've shifted from having a couple dozen people who regularly engaged in our food security workshops to now having more than 100 local households who are asking for our support to help them grow food at home, and consistently packed workshops full of people who are really excited about learning more about ancestral foods, how to harvest different plants in season, or how to butcher a seal, or how to make sauerkraut and pickles. People are excited about it. People are becoming really deeply empowered at a household level, at a family level, at an individual level. And that, I think, for me, is how I need to work to feel grounded in what I'm doing. I am very confident that other folks can and will do the organizing at a nation level, at a regional level, to uplift that kind of stuff into real policy change. But I just want to urge people that, even because the problem seems so big, it can often feel really disempowering trying to figure out what the way in is to that work or how you're going to make the big shift. But often the shift happens in lots of really minute steps that are actually really easy and really beautiful and really grounding to take. So I don't know if that's a best practice, but it's certainly a practice that's working really well in our community, and one that I'm really deeply proud of.
That's definitely a couple more practices came to mind. I'm thinking of the Schweppen communities where they've got a lot of moose and elk and deer, and the coastal communities that have a lot of fish, but they're wishing for moose, elk, and deer. Now, in talking to the chiefs in Schweppen, they don't buy fish off each other or buy moose meat off each other. They barter fish for elk, fish for moose and whatnot. Now, that's our historic trade and barter system, right? I think there's should be opportunities to revive that. We do have our own forms of food in our local area, but we've got long-standing trade relations with First Nations throughout the West Coast, whether it be me and Stalo trading for clams and prawns and kelp or whatever, or elk on the interior kind of thing, right? We should have opportunities to institute those kinds of relations, not be impeded by regulations or policies or laws, because we've done it for thousands of years, and these silly people come along, they disconnect us from it, right? And then the other one that comes to mind again is the Schweppen, where there's a lot of pine mushroom pickers in their territory, and it frustrated them over the years. And knowing the chiefs so well, they shared with me that this got to the point where they shut down the mushroom industry. They started issuing their own permits to anybody who wanted to come into their traditional territory to harvest pine mushrooms. They had to pay for a permit, and then they're monitored out there, right? So they're taking over control, reassuming a higher level of authority and jurisdiction over one component of foods in there. Because these guys, yes, they're picking it up, picking for the economy, but a lot of the locals are picking it for the elders, picking it for the medicines and the traditional foods, right? And some will sell absolutely because we need money to go to the store too, but it's our own sense of identity through the food that we consume, and how it is that we might trade and barter amongst the nations, and how do we broaden that diet amongst each other to everybody's benefit.
They're also great examples, and a few audience members brought up exactly that, like trade, bartering, like revitalizing, like grease trails and all the ways that we've been connected for a long time. So I'm really glad that you brought that up as well. And we got an audience question that's really interesting, and it kind of like it turns back a bit to what we were talking about a minute ago, but it's all connected. So I'm just going to read it out. They asked, the How's It et al. Aboriginal fishing rights case went on for over a decade. and DFO is still giving the nations a hard time implementing the decision after years of negotiation. How can we work together to force federal agencies to move faster and actually recognize Port 1 Indigenous rights, or better yet, prevent the tens of millions in court fees fighting First Nations? UNDRIP should help, but is it? And I'm sure we could come up with more examples than just that case. I don't know if either of you feel ready to answer first.
I mean, I can share here that, for a health example, it took decades to reconcile the Gladstone decision, which was, around our Supreme Court affirmed right to sell traditionally harvested spawn-on kelp. Like, that right was affirmed in the Supreme Court decision and still took decades to reconcile with DFO. And even though it has technically been reconciled, there have continued to be ongoing issues around the management of that fishery. And I know that folks in my nation have had to fight so incredibly hard to ensure that we have a voice in protecting herring stocks here. And, I remember clearly, I guess it must have been about 8 years ago now. I was pregnant with my firstborn, and I was on tribal council at the time. And I remember, we were looking at this incursion of incoming, commercial boats from outside who were coming in to participate in a kill fishery at a time when we knew the stocks were so low they wouldn't be able to sustain that. And there was no having a conversation with DFO about it. They opened that commercial fishery literally against the advice of their own scientists, as it transpired. And what it took was folks from the nation going over and literally occupying the DFO office across from our community, locking themselves into that office, having youth and families and community members living on the lawn of DFO saying, this can't happen. This is our territory. We know these stocks that we rely on are so heavily impacted and they cannot withstand what you are approving. And, it is frustrating and exhausting when Indigenous folks have to repeatedly literally put their bodies on the line to defend the integrity of stocks of things we rely on for food. It's appalling. It's frustrating. And I think one piece that emerged for me out of that time that was really beautiful was seeing non-Indigenous folks who were prepared to show up and be allies and disrupt systems, shut down big intersections in Vancouver, show up and protest at urban DFO offices. And I know that sometimes it doesn't feel like those things make a difference when you're participating in those actions. Sometimes you can't see the bigger picture of how it's actually making an impact. But speaking as someone who's in a really geographically remote place, and I often feel like we're fighting for what makes us who we are, so far away from the people who support us, it is of massive importance when people show up and put themselves behind the work that Indigenous people are doing. And it shouldn't have to be that way. And I hope someday that it won't be that way anymore. I'm not sure that we're going to regulate our way out of that sort of colonial culture. And I'm not sure there's going to be any, UN declaration or federal act that's going to just magically resolve that colonial attitude. But we need folks to be with us in very material ways and very physical ways and in spiritual ways too.
Tyrone.
It wasn't that long ago, Stephanie, that the Pope denounced the doctrine of discovery. And I feel that, and I should qualify that. I tell folks I'm not a lawyer, I'm a plumber, but I've been around for a while, right? And I got really good mentors. My mentor has been in leadership for over 40 years, so there's a lot of knowledge and experience there. But just the fact that the Pope denounces it doesn't mean that it all goes away and we're good again, right? It's going to take decades to untwist that doctrine of discovery, from the legal machinations of both Canada and British Columbia. And we're teasing it apart, but it's gonna take years to get there, and likely more Supreme Court wins. Because I'm thinking for us, it's the Sparrow case that again the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that our access to food comes only second to conservation. Yet when DFO manages, and I say manages in quotation marks, it's really mismanages, the marine commercial and recreational have access, and if there's anything left, we might have it. So completely at odds with the Supreme Court decision, but it's that the very fabric of Canada is so meshed with racism, with indifference, that we're not human beings, we're wards of the state kind of thing, right? We don't have any rights. And the doctrine played a big place in that. But if you look back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, it stated that the crowns, and this was the various colonizing crowns, had to enter into treaty with the indigenous people. And that didn't happen here in BC. So that's a starting lack of relation for us, is a lack of recognition from that treaty. Because if you think about the kind of Canada's confederation, British Columbia should never have been allowed to confederate with Canada because they didn't settle with us here in BC. They started some early treaties, but it just wasn't sufficient. So from a legal basis, that is there. More from a I think I just will call it a pragmatic approach on our behalf, Stephanie. Back when I was a happy plumber, I'd hear about all these protests, these roads being shut down, railways being shut down, offices, government offices being occupied for weeks on end, standoffs like Oka and whatnot. They're a regular happening. And we're really pushing our rights forward in a formal, concerted effort, right? Now we, as a people, we tend to be, I feel we tend to be a little bit too constrained in being proactive. Where well, one of my grand chiefs, and he's the one that's got 47 years as a leader now, tells me that we've turned into paper tigers, Stephanie. Where in the past we'd go out there and we shut down the highway, railway, and office. Now we write a really strongly worded letter. So I think one way to expedite some movement in our generation, next couple of decades, is to be proactive again, for our citizens to rely less on our chiefs and councils to go out there and block the road by themselves, and the citizens go out there with us. So strength in numbers, right? Because I can remember in the early 2000s when we shut down some roads here in Stalo country, at first there might only be 6 or 7 of us out. And then after a couple of days, another 10 or 20 added. And after 4 or 5 days, we may make it up to 100. Well, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, that first road shutdown would have started with 1,000 of us, of all ages, from children to elders. So we've kind of gone from being forceful in expressing our rights to be a little bit softer, rounder around the edges, trying to negotiate. And keep in mind, I do feel we do need to try to negotiate. But if we're negotiating, and I've been a negotiator, if I'm negotiating and there's a group of 1,000 Stalo out here blocking a highway or railway or something, that really empowers my negotiation capacity, right? We get more of what we want. So there's tend to be an over-reliance on a very small group of people to push this rights agenda. The band councils, whether you're elected or hereditary, there's just not enough of them. We need the force of our citizens, the force of all of our citizens of all ages to be there, to be wanting to support leadership in moving the agenda, whether it's fishing, hunting, gathering, access, land, whatever it is. We need to be a force again. And I could see some communities doing that better than others, but it's about rocking the boat a little bit, which is a negotiation tactic, right? But we need to activate and energize. We need to get our people out of the houses, get our youth away from their devices and screens, get them interested in their rights at earlier ages and participating in their rights, because it makes our job as leaders so much easier when we have that force, that strength, that knowledge, of people behind us, right? But it's a big agenda to move overall. But how do we take incremental steps to take advantage of something like the Declaration, or in some cases a Supreme Court decision may be applied, maybe not fulsomely, but may be applied, or we bridge a win with activity. Because I'm thinking of the Qqs fishing case recently, where it was recognized that they have access for a commercial fishery, and DFO shuts them down, but they went out and fished anyway. And up near your way, Jess, where the DFO wanted to open up a roe fishery, and you Coastal First Nation says no, the numbers are too low. You're actually going to call for a cease of fisheries to save stocks, right? So it's that being proactive that by everybody, not just leadership, I think is one of the best tactics going forward, Stephanie.
I'd actually love to hear you, Jess, kind of respond to that again, because another audience member asked a similar question about the role of chief and council in community-driven food systems. And this is something you spoke to me about, the more decentralized kind of individual approaches. I'd love to hear you just respond a bit more to what Tyrone said.
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely make the argument that chief and council play a role in supporting thriving food systems in our communities. I do better working outside of those systems. I really enjoy working at a very grassroots level in my community. So we don't tend to access government funding for the work that we do. We tend to be very focused on taking our mandate from our community and finding ways to involve and empower our community members in the work that we do. You know, I have a really strong belief that, just like Tyrone was saying, you can't just have leadership, whether it's elected or hereditary, out in front doing all of the work. You need to have a community that feels engaged and informed and empowered to step up and stand up for the things that they care about. And so for me, how that manifests in food work is, you know, trying to help make sure that nobody in my community is hungry, which is a big task in and of itself, and then B, helping them to also feel really connected to their food systems, to have love for their food systems so that they want to protect their food systems, whether that means becoming more involved in food production or food harvesting, or whether it means, you know, stepping up in those really tense political times where we require direct action to make change on how food systems are being protected and managed in our territories. You really need to have communities of people that are fully invested in that work, see themselves in the work, and see the pathway for themselves to be engaged in it and do the things. And, you know, I love working that way. It's so beautiful to me knowing that, you know, I feel like the least important person in the work that I do, because I have this incredible community of people all around me who are engaged and excited and like doing the hard work and showing up and saying, I want to be involved. I want to learn this. I want to do this. I'm here for this. This is part of who I am. And I think you need those cultural shifts in community to ensure that the work isn't being siloed and the work can't be sidelined, that the work is decentralized, it is infused in every household, every family, so that everybody sees themselves in it and everybody's there to stand up for it when they're needed.
Thank you for that. And this is a very closely related question, but the very top question we got from lots of audience members was, what can I do as an individual to support food sovereignty initiatives and also bring food sovereignty into their own lives? And this came from Indigenous and non-Indigenous people with question, people who are farmers and people who are urban, people who say, I have skills to share, and people who said, I have no skills, but I want to help. So what comes to mind when people are asking, what can I do at an individual level to support food security, food initiatives in my area? Maybe Tyrone, you can answer first.
Maybe starting this way, Steph, going back to being really tight on language, I'm not a big believer in food sovereignty because we simply don't have the relation here in Crown. And when even my own members and chiefs raise food sovereignty with me, I remind them of the Marshall Trilogy in the United States. In 1830, Justice John Marshall ruled that the tribes and the states have a form of sovereignty that isn't like Canada or France, but is more than Washington or California. So my relatives across the line here, as tribes, they can talk food sovereignty. We don't have their relation with the British Crown here. So we could take on more authority and more jurisdiction that are stepping stones towards sovereignty, but we have a long way to go. And what it's building on Jess's latest comments to this question here, it's about us all doing our own share of it. Like I've got a garden. I've always had a garden, and I've always, you know, eaten from the garden. I don't get a chance to hunt anymore. I'm just too busy in this leadership role. I do go out and gather mushrooms and medicines. I'm teaching my grand boys how to do that, and they catch on really quick. And I believe it's in them, right? They just need to be nurtured. Just need to be turn that page to remind them. That's a role that we have as parents and grandparents, is to educate our children, re-educate our children, because it's in them, right? So it's about taking on that ownership of what and whether, like, I'd say I'm confident in going out and doing anything out on the land, Stephanie, but a lot of our citizens aren't. But they can do one thing. They know, they remember their parents or grandparents teaching them these one or two things. Go out and do that, because our elders tell us when you're out in the land will teach you. So occupy that space. Don't be going to the grocery store when you've got a plot in your backyard that could easily be a garden. You could do some indoor gardening. Just every little bit helps. And I'm really surprised at how much when we're going into town in the winter to buy fruits and vegetables, just to hear the percentage that is thrown to waste after a certain period is remarkable, Stephanie. We need to be more careful shoppers and more careful growers, because we can't store it. Say my cabbage, I'll be eating them in the December because I know in January they're not going to be very good anymore, right? So it's got to be a thoughtful approach to our own local family, community food production, and how does we do it? When do we consume them? Knowing that traditionally we didn't consume certain foods year round; they're seasonal. So we don't need to produce food for the entire year. Let's enjoy cherries and peaches in the summertime, knowing that we're getting into apples and pears in the fall time and other berries too, right? So occupy that space as best you can, and you will gain more competency and experience over time.
And Jess?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the origin of this quote, but I really take it to heart that I think you need to do what you can where you are with what you have. And really importantly, you need to not get stuck. You know, it's really easy to look at the big picture of food insecurity or the changes that we need to make to our food systems or threats to our food systems and to be overwhelmed and to not know how to resolve it. You don't have to resolve the whole thing. You have to do the things that you can with the resources that are available to you. It's going to look different for everybody, but I think on a really core level, it's important for people to examine their values around food systems and start making the ethical choices that are available to them. You know, exactly like Tyrone said, you need to eat things that are in season if you can. You know, try to find foods that are produced relatively locally and not being shipped in from halfway across the world. You know, if you can go to a farmer's market and support a local grower, do the thing. If you are growing a garden and you have too much, share it with your neighbor. If your plant sets seeds, harvest the seeds, save the seeds, find a local seed bank, share that wealth with people. I think that you can't, you know, underestimate how powerful those small actions are. And the more you do them and the more that just becomes part of your ethic and part of your rhythm, I think the easier it gets to take bigger and bigger steps. And, you know, there are so many incredible food champions in every community doing incredible things. And, you know, look to who's leading that where you are and find the ways that you can to get behind them. It's beautiful work to do.
Thanks so much for that. And I can't believe that there's still so much that we could get to, but we're almost at time. So I would just like to invite you both to take a moment for any final words and maybe anything that maybe we didn't get to. I don't know, but I'll just give you each a moment just for a final word. How about Tyrone?
I think that when I'm advocating for my community, Stephanie, whether it's around food or fish or broadly, I can represent our citizens on reserve quite well because I'm living there with them. I know them. I do things with them, right? It's our urban citizens I really worry about, Stephanie. They don't have that close to home connection. They can't walk across the street to their parents' place to raid their fridge or something, right? And so we need to keep in mind that due to situations not driven by us, our citizens can't live at home all the time, but that doesn't mean we lose sight of them. Let's pay attention to them regardless of where they live, whether they're living in Vancouver here for me or Toronto or anywhere else. You know, we value the identity and the safety and well-being of our citizens irregardless. So I'd put that on the table as the last comment, Stephanie, is let's be mindful of where all of our citizens live, not just those of us that are on reserve.
Thanks so much for that. And Jess?
Yeah, I want to surface the comment that Nicole put in the chat that we also need to consider how to advocate for how migrant workers are treated in the agriculture. And I think like that is so important to recognize that, you know, food justice is also a human rights issue in many ways, in many cases. And that's just such an important component. I think if I had like a last thought to share, it would be that, you know, for me, food is such an important manifestation of community and connectedness. I don't feel good. I don't feel grounded if I'm not connected, if I'm not in community, I'm not thinking about other people. And if I'm not, you know, collaborating with other people towards something. And food is just such a beautiful and important and pretty universal point of connection and community building. And, you know, although there's a lot of work to do and although the work can be daunting, I just really urge people to look at it as a point of connectivity with the people around you and to really support mutual thriving in the way you approach your food work.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, Jess and Tyrone, for an incredible discussion. I said in my tweet, I could listen to you both talk for hours. It's very true. And thank you to all the audience members for your incredibly passionate and like detailed, in-depth questions. So many questions about food security, food sovereignty, all of our food systems. I really hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I hope maybe a few of you are inspired to join our 5,900 members and get your very special toque. And yeah, I hope that you all check out the series Nourish. You can read more thoughts from Tyrone and Jess, and there's a lot more examples of what we're talking about that you can read about from several different First Nations, and there will be more stories coming down the line. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you for being here, and áust. Take care. See you later.